All right, let's dive deep into international relations today.
Sounds good.
We're going to be breaking down essentials of international relations.
Oh, a classic text.
It's kind of our cheat sheet for how global politics actually works.
The decoder ring.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So we'll be pulling out the most, I guess, useful and surprising insights from this book.
The stuff that really matters.
Yeah, so think of it as like international relations for the real world, cutting through all that dense theory.
Exactly. Think of this as like a backstage pass
Oh, okay.
to how global decisions are actually made,
I like it.
the forces at play,
Yeah.
and why things are the way they are.
Okay, so let's start with the basics.
Sure.
What even is international relations?
That's the big question.
Yeah, it feels like it's more than just countries getting along or not getting along on the world stage.
You're absolutely right.
Right.
It's way more than just that.
Yeah.
It's about understanding this complex web of relationships
Mm-hmm.
between states, obviously,
Yeah.
but also those increasingly influential non-state actors,
Oh,
like multinational corporations, NGOs,
right.
and even individuals.
So individuals have a role to play in international relations.
They do, in a big way, actually.
Oh.
It's about power dynamics, for sure,
Yeah.
but it's also about how ideas and norms and perceptions
Oh, interesting.
actually shape how states behave.
So it's a lot more nuanced than just like country A is friends with country B, enemies with country C.
That's precisely, yeah, it's a lot more complex than that.
Okay, so to really grasp all of this, I think we need to start with some key terms.
Okay, yeah. Let's define some things.
Like, I know I get these mixed up all the time. State versus nation.
Ah, yes, those are often used interchangeably, which causes a lot of confusion.
Yeah, help me untangle these.
So think of a state as that political structure
Okay.
with a defined territory,
Mm-hmm.
permanent population, a government,
Yeah.
and crucially, sovereignty,
Sovereignty.
meaning it calls the shots within its borders.
Got-
Whereas a nation, think of that more as that shared identity,
Okay.
language, culture, history,
Mm-hmm.
that feeling of belonging together.
Okay, so a state is the political entity.
Yeah.
A nation is that cultural kind of connection.
The glue that holds them together.
Yeah, but that means that not all nations have their own state, right?
Exactly. That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
You have the Kurds, for example.
Okay.
They're a nation spread across multiple countries,
Right.
but they don't have a state of their own.
Yeah.
And that can be a source of a lot of tension
Makes sense.
and conflict.
So you have like a nation like the Kurds, but they don't have that political structure, that state.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And then you have the flip side,
Okay.
where state boundaries encompass multiple nations.
Oh, okay. So that would be a state
Exactly.
with maybe a couple of different cultural groups within it.
Precisely.
And that can lead to internal problems too, I imagine.
Absolutely. That can also lead to conflict.
Yeah, it makes me think of, and I won't name any names,
Yeah, no, I understand.
but there are a few that come to mind where you have those internal divisions,
Right.
and that kind of clashes with those state boundaries
That's a great point.
and leads to instability.
Absolutely. That's a perfect example
Yeah.
of how those neat little definitions
Yeah.
get messy in the real world.
Right.
And it's crucial to remember that the modern international system, as we know it,
Mhm.
has its roots in Europe,
Okay.
specifically after the 30 Years' War.
Okay, so this is going way back.
Yeah, bit of history here.
Yeah.
That's when the idea of state sovereignty really took hold,
Okay.
which laid the groundwork for how we understand states interacting on the world stage today.
So Europe kind of wrote the rule book
In a lot of ways.
for international relations.
It's the foundation of the modern system.
Interesting. But how do we actually make sense of all these interactions between states?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It feels like there needs to be some kind of framework or something to help us understand, why countries do what they do.
Right, you need some sort of guide.
Yeah, some sort of lens.
Exactly, and that's where theories of international relations come in.
Okay.
They're like different lenses
Mhm.
to view global politics.
Okay.
And the big three you'll encounter are realism, liberalism, and constructivism.
Ah, the classic trio.
They're the heavy hitters.
I feel like realism always sounds kind of grim, though.
It does get a bad rap
Yeah.
for being cynical.
Is it all just like conflict and power struggles?
It's not that simple.
Okay.
It's more about acknowledging
Mm-hmm.
the reality of power dynamics
Okay.
in a world without a global governing body.
Right. There's no one in charge, really.
Exactly, it's anarchy.
Yeah.
And realists believe that states are the main actors,
Okay.
driven by self-interest and a desire to survive
Right.
in this inherently anarchic system.
So it's kind of like survival of the fittest.
in a sense.
Yeah, global Game of Thrones.
Exactly. A constant struggle for power.
Okay, well, that doesn't sound very hopeful.
It's not always pretty.
But is that really how the world works all the time?
Well, let's consider the stag hunt analogy
Okay.
by Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Okay, I've heard of him.
So imagine a group of hunters are cooperating
Mm-hmm.
to catch a stag so they can all feast.
Right, working together.
Exactly. But then one hunter sees a hare.
Oh,
They could easily catch it for themselves.
yeah,
But if they do that, the others will lose out on the stag.
right.
So even though cooperation would yield the best outcome.
Yeah, the stag would feed everybody,
Exactly.
but they're tempted by that quick win, the hare.
Right. There's always that temptation to prioritize your own immediate needs.
Even if it undermines the collective good.
Exactly. And that's the dilemma realists highlight.
It's like that tension between short-term gain and long-term stability.
You got it.
Okay, so realists aren't exactly holding their breath for world peace.
They tend to be skeptical of that.
But what about liberalism then?
Liberalism.
Does it offer a more optimistic outlook?
It definitely leans in a more hopeful direction.
Okay.
So instead of seeing the world as inevitably cutthroat, liberals believe that cooperation is not only possible,
Okay.
but essential for progress and peace.
So they see the potential for cooperation even in a world that often seems very chaotic.
Precisely. They believe we can overcome those challenges.
Okay, but is that naive?
It's a good question.
I mean, we've seen plenty of examples where cooperation just breaks down, even when it seems like it's in everyone's best interest.
We're not naive to the challenges,
Okay.
but they believe cooperation is both possible and beneficial.
Okay.
They often point to examples like the establishment of the United Nations or the European Union
Right.
as evidence that states can overcome their self-interest
Okay.
and create lasting partnerships.
So those are pretty compelling examples.
They're big, complex institutions,
Yeah.
but they demonstrate that cooperation is possible.
Okay, so for liberals, it's not just wishful thinking. They see actual mechanisms and principles.
Yes, concrete things
Yeah.
that can foster cooperation.
And mitigate conflict.
Exactly.
Okay, but where does constructivism fit into all of this?
Constructivism shakes things up a bit.
Okay, how so?
It challenges the assumption that the world is just a collection of material forces and predetermined interests.
Okay.
It argues that the way we understand the world, our ideas, norms, and identities, actually shape how states behave.
So it's less about what is and more about how we perceive what is.
Exactly.
So even the idea of a state or sovereignty is kind of a social construct that we've all agreed upon.
Precisely. They're shared understandings that have evolved over time.
That's mind-blowing.
It's a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, so while realists see power as this like tangible thing, military strength, economic clout,
Right, the material stuff.
constructivists see it as something that can be shaped by beliefs, ideas.
Absolutely, by social forces.
Okay. Like social movements, even cultural shifts.
Exactly. It's much more fluid and dynamic.
Wow. Okay, so constructivism adds a whole new dimension to how we analyze international relations.
It broadens our understanding.
It's not just about the chessboard and the pieces, it's about how the players see the game itself
That's a great analogy.
and how those perceptions can change the rules.
You got it. It's not fixed.
Okay, so we've got our theoretical toolkit sorted out.
We've got our lenses.
Yeah, but let's get down to brass tacks now.
Okay, let's get practical.
What actually makes a state powerful?
Besides a really impressive collection of flags.
Yeah, besides that, because flags are cool, but
Yeah.
what else is there?
Well, the textbook breaks it down into 3 categories.
Okay.
Natural sources, tangible sources, and intangible sources of power.
Okay, let's start with the natural one.
All right, back to nature.
Geography, I feel like that's an obvious one, right?
Absolutely.
If you control the Strait of Hormuz,
Right.
you control a lot of the world's oil flow.
Geography can be a huge advantage.
Or a disadvantage.
Depending on where you are.
Exactly. Look at Russia.
Oh, okay. Yeah, huge country.
Enormous.
Hard to invade,
Very difficult to conquer.
but also probably difficult to govern.
That too, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, that makes
And then natural resources.
Okay.
Having access to valuable resources like oil, minerals, fertile land,
Right.
that can give a state a lot of leverage.
So a small country with a strategically valuable resource like oil can still be quite powerful.
Absolutely. Think about those oil-rich Gulf states.
Right. They punch above their weight.
Exactly. Control of vital resources is a game changer.
Okay, what about the tangible sources?
So tangible sources are things you can measure,
Okay.
like industrial development, infrastructure, military capabilities,
Yeah, those are the classic measures of power.
the building blocks of traditional state power.
It makes sense that a country with a strong industrial base, modern infrastructure, a well-equipped military would be more powerful.
Right. Those are the material foundations of power. Okay, but then there are the intangible sources, and those seem a little harder to grasp.
Intangible sources are all about perception and influence.
Okay.
Things like national image, public support, the quality of leadership.
Those are trickier to measure,
They are
but they're still important.
absolutely essential for understanding how states project power.
Okay, so a country with a positive global image, a united population, and a savvy leader would have an advantage on the world stage.
Exactly. It's soft power
Yeah, the power of persuasion,
and attraction.
not
That-
just coercion.
Right. Sometimes a strong national image can allow a state to punch above its weight.
Okay, I like that. Punching above their weight.
Think about Canada.
Okay.
Not a military superpower,
Right.
but they have a great reputation.
Yeah, they're seen as a good guy.
Exactly. Diplomacy, peacekeeping.
Yeah.
That gives them a certain level of influence.
That exceeds their, like, raw military power.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've got the ingredients of state power. We understand that.
We've broken it down.
But how do states actually go about making foreign policy decisions?
The million-dollar question.
It seems so complex.
It is a very complex process.
It's so many factors to consider.
Absolutely.
It's not like they just spin a wheel and decide to invade a country, right?
Thankfully not.
Okay.
There's no spinning wheel involved.
So how does it work?
Well, the textbook outlines three main models of decision-making.
Okay.
The rational model, the bureaucratic organizational model, and the pluralist model.
Okay, let's start with the rational one, I guess.
All right, the rational actor model.
Does that assume that states act like these perfectly logical chess players?
It's a bit of an ideal.
Okay.
It assumes that states are like single, unitary actors with a clearly defined national interest.
Right, like a single mind making decisions.
Exactly.
But in the real world, it's a lot messier, right?
Reality is often messier than the models.
Okay, so how does the rational model explain that?
Well, it proposes that states go through this rational process. They identify a problem, they set goals, they consider all the options,
Okay.
and then they choose the policy that best achieves those goals.
So it's all very logical and calculated.
In theory, yes.
But wouldn't that require perfect information and foresight?
You're hitting on the limitations of the model.
Yeah, because I feel like in the real world, there are always surprises, things you couldn't have anticipated.
Absolutely. Unforeseen factors.
And those can throw a wrench in the works.
They can derail even the best laid plans.
Okay, so the rational model is a starting point.
A useful simplification.
But it doesn't always capture the full complexity of things.
It's not the whole picture.
All right, what about the bureaucratic organizational model then?
So this model focuses on the inner workings of government.
Okay, less about logic, more about bureaucracy.
Exactly. It argues that foreign policy decisions aren't always made by a single rational actor, but are shaped by organizational structures, standard operating procedures, internal politics.
So it's like a giant bureaucratic machine with lots of moving parts.
A lot of gears and levers.
Yeah, and those can influence the final outcome.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's not about a grand strategy.
Right.
It's about who controls the flow of information.
Or who has the better PowerPoint presentation.
Exactly. Those things matter.
That's a little unsettling.
It's the reality of how decisions are made.
All right, and then there's the pluralist model.
The messy world of domestic politics.
I'm guessing that one brings in all those competing interests?
Precisely. The pluralist model acknowledges that foreign policy decisions aren't made in a vacuum.
Okay.
They're influenced by a whole range of domestic actors.
Like interest groups, public opinion, the media.
All of that and more.
So a state's leaders have to balance all these domestic pressures with what's happening on the international stage.
It's a complex balancing act.
It's like playing chess on two boards at the same time.
A great analogy.
Okay, so we've got these different models for understanding how foreign policy decisions are made.
Each offering a different perspective.
But let's shift gears a bit now
Okay, where are we headed?
to a topic that's sadly central to international relations.
I think I know where you're going.
War.
It's an unfortunate reality.
Yeah, it's been a constant throughout human history.
Sadly, yes.
And I was reading in the textbook
Hmm.
that there have only been like a couple of centuries of complete peace.
Over thousands of years.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought.
It is.
But while those big interstate wars,
Classic clash of nations.
yeah, those seem to be less frequent these days.
Thankfully.
We're seeing more internal conflicts, those civil wars.
Intrastate wars, they're on the rise.
Right, and aren't those often even more complicated,
They can be incredibly complex.
with multiple factions vying for power?
Absolutely. And it gets even messier when outside actors get involved.
Right, turning it into a proxy war,
Exactly, where different states support different sides.
like what we're seeing in.
We see that happening in many conflicts today.
Yeah, it's like a twisted game of chess where the pawns are actual human lives.
It's a powerful analogy.
Yeah, and then there's the distinction between conventional and unconventional warfare.
Right, the changing nature of war.
So conventional warfare is what we typically imagine.
The traditional battles.
Armies clashing on battlefields.
Tanks, artillery, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, but unconventional warfare is more about asymmetry, right?
Exactly, where weaker actors use different tactics.
Guerrilla warfare, terrorism, cyber attacks.
Those are all examples of unconventional warfare.
So it's about disrupting and destabilizing a more powerful opponent.
It's about leveling the playing field.
Okay, so that's where guerrilla warfare comes in.
Exactly.
Hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, sabotage,
It's a classic strategy.
used by groups that can't take on a larger enemy head-on.
They had to be more creative.
And terrorism, that's about deliberately targeting civilians.
To create fear and advance a political agenda.
It's a tactic often used by groups that feel they have no other option.
They feel like their voices aren't being heard.
But the deliberate targeting of innocent people, that's what makes it so horrific.
It's a very difficult issue.
It is. And then there's cyber warfare.
The digital battlefield.
It seems like every day there's a news story about hacking or data breaches.
It's a rapidly evolving domain.
And it presents new challenges
For sure.
for international relations.
Absolutely.
Because it can be hard to attribute these attacks.
Attribution is a major challenge.
Yeah, like, is a cyber attack an act of war?
That's a question that's still being debated.
It's not a traditional military attack.
Right, but it can have devastating consequences.
It feels like we're entering uncharted territory here.
The rules of engagement are still being written.
Yeah. But let's pivot to a question that seems fundamental to all of this.
Okay, what's the question?
Can states actually cooperate effectively?
The big question.
Or are they doomed to be trapped in the cycle of self-interest and conflict?
The realist perspective would say the latter.
Right, because realists see states as inherently driven by this desire to maximize their own power,
Exactly, it's a self-help system.
even if it means undermining cooperation.
They're always looking out for number one.
So how do they explain the existence of international organizations or treaties then?
Realists are pragmatic.
Okay.
They acknowledge that cooperation can happen,
Mm-hmm.
but they see it as being driven by strategic necessity,
Okay.
not altruism.
So states might cooperate if it's in their interest to do so.
Exactly, to address a shared threat, for example,
Okay.
or to secure access to a vital resource.
But they're always wary of the potential for others to exploit the situation.
They're always looking for the catch.
No kumbaya moments then.
Not in the realist world.
All right, but what about the liberals?
The optimists.
They seem to have a more positive take on cooperation.
They do. They believe that even in an anarchic system, states can find ways to cooperate effectively,
Okay.
and that doing so is beneficial for everyone.
So what are their arguments for why cooperation is both possible and desirable?
Well, liberals emphasize the role of international institutions,
Okay.
democratic values, and economic interdependence.
So those are the key ingredients for cooperation.
They're the building block.
Okay, let's break those down a bit.
Sure.
Starting with international institutions.
Liberals see institutions like the United Nations,
Mm-hmm.
the World Trade Organization, international courts,
Okay.
as providing a framework for cooperation.
Okay.
They help reduce uncertainty, build trust.
And make it more costly for states to cheat?
Exactly. They create incentives for cooperation.
Okay. And what about democratic values?
Liberals believe that democracies are more likely to cooperate with each other.
Okay, why is that?
They share a commitment to peaceful resolution of disputes. They're accountable to their citizens.
So they're less likely to go to war with each other.
In theory, yes.
Okay, and then there's economic interdependence.
Right. The idea that when countries are economically linked, they have a strong incentive to avoid conflict.
Because war would disrupt trade and hurt everyone's economy.
Exactly. It creates a shared interest in peace.
So it's not just about being nice, it's about self-interest.
It's about recognizing that cooperation is often the most rational choice.
Okay, so liberals see cooperation as a win-win,
A positive-sum game.
where everyone can benefit.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got realists who are skeptical of cooperation,
Right. They see it as a strategic necessity.
and liberals who see it as essential for progress and peace.
They're the optimists
It's fascinating how two different perspectives can look at the same world.
and come to such different conclusions.
But let's move on to another crucial topic,
What's that?
international law.
The rules of the road.
It's a system of rules and principles that govern relations between states.
It's the framework for international order.
But how does it actually work in practice?
It's a good question.
I mean, is it just a bunch of unenforceable agreements?
It's more than that.
Okay, because there's no global police force to enforce it, right?
It's true.
So how does it actually work?
Well, there are a few mechanisms at play,
Okay,
both formal and informal.
like what?
One key mechanism is reciprocity.
Okay, what's that?
It means that states often comply with international law because they know that if they violate it,
Yeah.
other states might do the same to them.
So it's like a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing.
Exactly. There's a self-interest in following the rules.
Because if you start breaking them, everyone else might too.
And then you end up in a world where no one trusts each other.
Yeah, it creates chaos.
Precisely.
So it's better to stick to the rules, even if it's not always in your immediate interest.
It's about the long-term benefits of a stable international order.
Okay, that makes sense. But what happens when a state does violate international law?
There are a few options.
Okay.
One is sanctions,
Okay.
economic, diplomatic, or even military measures.
All right, like punishment.
Exactly. It's the international community trying to enforce compliance.
Peer pressure on a global scale.
You could say that.
But sanctions don't always work, do they?
They're not always effective.
So what else is there?
Another important mechanism is international courts,
Okay.
like the International Court of Justice.
Right, the ICJ?
They can hear cases brought by states against other states.
And their rulings are binding.
They're not always enforceable,
Okay.
but they carry moral weight.
So even if a state could ignore a ruling, it might face reputational damage.
Exactly. States care about their image.
It's like a global court of public opinion.
In a way, yes.
Okay, that's interesting. And then there are less formal mechanisms, right?
Absolutely.
Like those NGOs that name and shame countries that violate human rights.
Exactly. They can be quite effective.
It's amazing how much power public opinion can have.
It's a force to be reckoned with.
There is. So international law relies on this combination of self-interest, pressure from the international community.
And appeals to morality and reputation.
It's a very different system from domestic law.
It's a unique system.
But it seems like it can be effective, at least sometimes.
Definitely has its successes.
Okay, good. Well, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to touch on one more crucial topic. International political economy.
The intersection of economics and politics.
Exactly. It's basically the study of how those two forces intertwine on the world stage.
A very important area of study.
Especially in this era of globalization and interconnected markets
Absolutely.
and the rise of multinational corporations.
They're major players.
Yeah, so what are the key things to understand about this intersection of economics and politics?
Well, it's about recognizing that economic power
Mm-hmm.
is a major source of influence
Okay.
in international relations.
So it's not just about military might anymore.
It's about economic leverage as well.
Okay.
And the textbook outlines three main theoretical perspectives
Yep.
on international political economy.
Hit me with those.
We have economic liberalism.
Economic nationalism and economic radicalism.
All right, let's start with economic liberalism.
All right, back to liberalism.
Does it have anything to do with the liberalism we talked about earlier?
You're on the right track.
Okay.
It builds on those same principles of cooperation and interdependence,
Mm-hmm.
but applies them to the realm of economics.
Okay.
It emphasizes free trade, open markets, and limited government intervention.
So economic liberals would be big fans of globalization then.
Absolutely.
Free trade agreements,
Yes.
the free flow of capital across borders
They see those trends as beneficial.
for overall economic growth
Exactly.
and prosperity,
They believe the market should be the primary driver of economic activity.
not the state.
Right. They're skeptical of government intervention.
Okay, so it's a very hands-off approach.
Laissez-faire economics.
But what about the people who are left behind by globalization?
That's a key criticism.
Those who lose their jobs to outsourcing or cheaper imports?
It's a valid concern.
Would economic liberals just say that's the price of progress?
They might argue that those are the growing pains
Okay.
of a more efficient global economy,
Right, what about economic nationalism then?
sometimes called mercantilism.
Okay.
It prioritizes the economic interests of the state.
Above all else.
Exactly.
So it's kind of the opposite of economic liberalism.
In many ways, yes.
Okay.
They see economic activity as a zero-sum game.
Okay, so one state's gain is another state's loss.
Precisely. They're concerned about competition.
So they would be more skeptical of free trade
Absolutely.
and globalization.
They see those as potential threats.
And they'd be more likely to support policies that protect domestic industries.
Sectionist policies.
Tariffs, subsidies, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They want to give their own companies an advantage.
So while economic liberals advocate for letting the market do its thing,
The invisible hand.
economic nationalists want a more visible hand.
The guiding hand of the state.
Interesting. And then there's economic radicalism.
The critics.
Yeah.
We got a taste of how power dynamics actually play out
Power is always at play
on the world stage.
on that global stage.
How states make those foreign policy decisions.
Those crucial decisions.
And that constant tension
Yeah,
between cooperation and conflict.
that push and pull.
So today we're going to zoom in
Okay.
on some of the biggest challenges
The big ones
confronting the international system.
in the 21st century.
Challenges that are increasingly transnational, right?
Yeah, they go beyond borders,
Yeah.
affecting not just states,
Mhm.
but people all over the world.
Right. They spill over, impacting everyone to some degree.
They're interconnected.
We're talking about migration, global health, the environment.
Those are the big ones. Issues that are interconnected and, frankly, increasingly urgent.
Absolutely, they demand our attention.
They do.
And these issues raise some fundamental questions about how we approach security, development, even the idea of state sovereignty.
Yeah, like state sovereignty, that idea that states have ultimate authority
Right.
within their own borders.
But those lines are getting blurred
Right, exactly.
between domestic and international.
It feels like uncharted territory in a lot of ways.
We're in new waters.
Yeah, grappling with challenges that require new ways of thinking,
We need fresh perspectives.
new approaches to international cooperation.
We need to adapt.
It can feel a bit daunting.
It is a daunting task,
It is.
but it's also exciting.
Okay. Yeah, how so?
It's an exciting time to be studying, thinking about international relations.
Okay.
We're seeing new ideas emerge,
Mm-hmm.
new actors,
Okay.
new possibilities for shaping a more just and sustainable world.
Okay, I like that. So where do we even begin?
Let's start with migration. It's a phenomenon that's been part of human history forever,
Right. People have always moved.
but it's taken on a new urgency and complexity.
Yeah, I feel like we're seeing unprecedented levels of migration and displacement,
You're absolutely right.
driven by conflict, poverty, climate change, the list goes on.
All of those factors are pushing people to move,
Yeah,
and it's creating humanitarian crises
on a massive scale.
on a scale we haven't seen before.
The Syrian refugee crisis, that's a really stark example.
A tragic situation.
Images of families fleeing war, risking their lives to reach safety.
It's heartbreaking.
It's really tested the capacity of the international community.
It's exposed the limitations of the system.
Okay, in what way?
Well, we have a system that's still largely built on that principle of state sovereignty.
Yeah, that idea that states control their borders
Exactly.
and decide who they let in.
Right.
But then we also have this concept of human rights,
Which emphasizes the dignity of every individual.
regardless of their nationality or status.
Precise.
And those two principles often clash.
They do, especially when it comes to migration.
So you have states trying to balance their own security concerns with their obligations to protect refugees.
It's a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, no easy answers there.
Not at all.
So how do we reconcile these competing principles?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah,
The textbook mentions the concept of human security.
right. We touched on that earlier.
It offers a potential way forward.
It's a way of thinking about security that goes beyond just protecting states.
Exactly.
It focuses on protecting individuals.
It's a more holistic approach.
So instead of just building walls and tightening border controls,
Right. The fortress mentality.
a human security approach would suggest addressing the root causes of migration.
Poverty, conflict, lack of opportunity.
It's about creating conditions where people feel safe in their own countries.
so they don't feel compelled to leave.
Okay, so it's a preventative approach,
Exactly.
addressing the underlying issues.
It's about recognizing that security is about protecting people.
Not just borders.
Precisely.
Okay, and this approach has relevance for other transnational challenges as well, right?
Absolutely.
Like global health.
That's another area where those traditional state-centric approaches are failing.
Yeah, in a world that's so interconnected,
We're all
a
connected.
health crisis in one part of the world.
Can quickly become everyone's problem.
Exactly.
We're living in a much smaller world now.
Yeah, thanks to globalization.
And advances in transportation.
Makes sense.
Diseases can spread much faster than ever before.
The SARS outbreak back in 2002.
That was a wake-up call
Yeah, it showed how vulnerable we are
to infectious diseases
in this globalized world.
that spread so quickly
From China to multiple countries.
in a matter of weeks.
Causing panic and economic disruption.
It was a taste of things to come.
And then, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic.
That really brought it home.
It showed how quickly a virus can spread,
Across borders,
disrupt our lives.
overwhelm healthcare system.
It really exposed our weaknesses, right?
It showed how unprepared we were
As a global community.
for a pandemic of that scale.
And it highlighted the importance of international cooperation.
Absolutely. We have to work together.
No single country can solve a global pandemic on its own.
We need to share information,
Resources.
expertise.
So how do those different theoretical lenses we talked about view global health challenges?
They offer different perspectives.
Okay.
Realists, with their emphasis on state security.
Right. Always thinking about power.
They tend to view global health through that lens.
So they're concerned about diseases destabilizing states.
Exactly.
And they'd prioritize protecting their own population.
Even if it means limiting cooperation,
Or hoarding resources.
it's a protect yourself first mentality.
Okay, so a realist approach might involve border controls, quarantines,
Those are classic realist tools.
even competition for vaccines.
It's about securing your own needs.
Okay, what about liberals?
The liberals, on the other hand, emphasize the importance of international cooperation
Yeah.
and institutions.
So working through organizations like the World Health Organization,
Absolutely. Coordinating responses,
sharing information.
providing assistance.
So for liberals, it's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
A global community facing a shared threat.
Okay, and what about the constructivists?
Constructivists would focus on how ideas and norms shape our response to global health crises.
So the way an issue is
The
presented,
framing,
the language used,
the narratives we tell.
all of that can influence how states respond.
Absolutely. It shapes perceptions and policies
So if a disease outbreak is framed as a security threat,
rather than a public health issue.
it might lead to a more militarized response.
Exactly. Border closures, restrictions on movement.
So the way we talk about these issues matters.
It has real-world consequences.
Yeah, it seems like each perspective offers valuable insights.
They each glom something to the table.
But one thing's for sure, we can't afford to ignore these challenges.
Global health is everyone's concern.
And that brings us to perhaps the most daunting challenge of all,
What's that?
the environment.
Ah, the big one.
Climate change, pollution, deforestation,
The list goes on.
resource scarcity.
It's a lot to grapple with.
It is. It feels like we're bombarded with news about environmental crises every day.
It's overwhelming.
It's hard to know where to even begin.
But the key is to remember that these issues are interconnected.
Okay.
We can't address them in isolation.
It's a system.
A complex web of interlinked challenges.
So let's break it down a bit.
Okay.
Climate change, that's often at the top of the agenda these days.
And for good reason.
Yeah, we're already experiencing the impact.
More extreme weather.
Rising sea levels.
The science is clear.
Yeah.
Human activity is causing the planet to warm.
At an alarming rate.
It's disrupting the climate system.
And those consequences are potentially catastrophic.
Mass displacement, food shortages, water scarcity,
Conflict over
the
resources.
spread of diseases.
Yes, that's-
It's a serious threat.
And the most vulnerable populations will be hit the hardest.
Those who have the least resources to adapt.
So climate change isn't just an environmental issue,
It's a human issue,
a social justice issue.
a security issue.
Yeah, it's all connected. But what can we actually do about it?
There have been a number of international agreements.
Like the Paris Agreement.
That's the most well-known.
Nearly 200 countries have signed on.
A landmark agreement
It aims to limit global warming.
to well below 2 degrees Celsius.
But it seems like every time there's a climate summit,
Hmm.
There are protests and criticisms
There's a lot of frustration.
that the agreements aren't ambitious enough.
Or the countries aren't doing enough.
Yeah, it feels like you're racing against the clock.
That sense of urgency is warranted.
But are there any reasons for hope?
There are.
Okay, tell me something hopeful.
We're seeing a growing global movement demanding action on climate change.
Okay.
We're seeing technological innovations,
Like renewable energy,
solar, wind,
Yeah.
geothermal.
sustainable agriculture.
There are solutions out there.
But climate change isn't the only environmental challenge we face.
You're right. There's
That's
more.
deforestation,
A major problem.
pollution,
Contaminating our air and water.
resource scarcity.
Water, food, minerals.
All of these issues are interconnected.
We have to address them holistically.
Recognizing the links between environmental sustainability, social justice, economic development,
And peace and security.
it's a tall order.
It's a complex challenge
But environmental challenges are going to be at the forefront
of international relations.
in the 21st century.
They're already front and center.
So how do these transnational issues change how we think about international relations?
They're challenging our assumptions
About power dynamics?
and the role of states.
It's not just about states anymore.
It's a more complex picture.
Those theoretical frameworks we talked about,
Realism, liberalism, constructivism.
they can help us understand these shifts.
They provide different lenses.
So it's not just about applying those theories to explain events.
Right.
It's about recognizing that these transnational challenges
We're reshaping the very landscape.
of international relations,
The game is changing.
it feels like we're at a pivotal moment
A turning point.
where the old rules are being rewritten
We need new approaches.
to navigate this complex world.
We have to adapt.
I'm eager to hear more about how those theoretical perspectives grapple with these shifts.
Then you won't want to miss the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, we'll be right back.
All right, deep divers, welcome back for the final part of our exploration into international relations.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from states and power to the challenges of cooperation.
The messy realities of war.
And those pressing transnational issues.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And it feels like we're witnessing a real shift.
A paradigm shift.
Yeah, a move away from that state-centric view
The old way of looking at things.
towards something more nuanced, interconnected,
And messy.
definitely messy. That's why it's crucial to revisit those theoretical frameworks.
Yeah, those different lenses.
Realism, liberalism, and constructivism.
They can help us make sense of all this.
Each offers a unique perspective.
Okay, so let's start with realism.
The classic power politics perspective,
It's often seen as the most state-centric.
with its focus on national interest
The struggle for power.
in an anarchic system.
So how does it adapt to a world where non-state actors are so prominent?
Well, realism is about understanding power dynamics,
Okay.
regardless of who's wielding that power.
So they wouldn't just dismiss those non-state actors.
No, they recognize that they can exert influence.
Okay.
But realists would still emphasize that states hold the upper hand.
They still have the armies, the territory.
You set the rules of the game,
Right. But what about those transnational issues?
the ones that cross borders.
Yeah, like climate change or pandemics.
Those are tricky for realists.
Because they can't be solved by any single state acting alone.
Right, they require cooperation.
But realists are so focused on state power and self-interest.
Well, realists are also pragmatic.
No.
They recognize that states must cooperate sometimes
Okay.
to address shared threats.
But they're always thinking about their own national interest.
Absolutely.
So a realist might support an international agreement,
On something like climate change.
but only if it benefits their state.
They're not in it for altruistic reasons
Okay, so they're adapting, but they're not abandoning those core beliefs.
about power and self-interest.
Okay, what about liberalism then?
Liberalism seems tailor-made for these transnational challenges.
Because of its focus on cooperation.
Exactly. They see these challenges as proof
Of our interconnectedness.
that we need to work together.
So they'd be the champions of global governance.
Absolutely.
Multilateralism, international organizations.
They believe in those institutions
But those institutions often get criticized.
for being bureaucratic.
Ineffective.
Liberals would argue that we need to strengthen them.
Okay, so they recognize the limitations.
But they see the potential.
To solve problems collectively.
Exactly.
But how do they deal with the issue of state sovereignty?
That's a tension for liberals.
States don't like giving up their authority.
It's a balancing act.
So how do you convince states to cooperate?
By showing them that it's in their best interest.
That the benefits outweigh the costs.
Exactly.
Okay, and liberals often point to those success stories,
The eradication of smallpox,
the Montreal Protocol,
the World Trade Organization.
as proof that cooperation can work.
It's not just a pipe dream.
Okay, so liberalism offers a framework for hope.
A path towards a more cooperative world.
Okay, and lastly, constructivism.
The new kid on the block.
It seems uniquely suited for understanding those transnational challenges.
Because it focuses on ideas and norms.
So how we perceive these issues
That we frame them.
can shape how we respond.
Absolutely.
So if climate change is framed as a security threat,
It might lead to a different response.
than if it's seen as an environmental problem. Okay, so the language we use matters.
The narratives we tell.
And constructivists also emphasize those transnational advocacy networks.
Like Amnesty International,
Yeah, good.
Greenpeace.
Doctors Without Borders.
They can change the conversation and put pressure on states.
So even though states are still the main actors,
They're not immune to the influence of ideas.
okay, it's about recognizing that power isn't just material.
It's also about ideas.
The power to change minds.
They shape behavior.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
We've covered a lot.
From the basics of international relations.
To those pressing global challenges.
And we've seen how those theoretical lenses,
Can help us make sense of it all.
it's a complex world out there.
But it's also a world full of possibilities
We have the knowledge, the tools, the interconnectedness,
to tackle these challenges.
but it's going to require cooperation
And a shared
for
commitment
those values that we've been talking about.
that we all share.
So keep exploring these issues
Engage in those thoughtful debates
and consider your own role.
in shaping a better world.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.
Keep diving deep.